thank you, Tony, for showing up. And thank you all because we have been looking forward to this for a long time. Those who don't know, I'm John Brook, head of the center, and we are here to talk about the ancient state in Eastern Africa. Chap Kasimba comes to us from Maritime University, where he is the chair of anthropology. I understand not totally happily the chair of anthropology. The chair of anthropology, where he started in 2013 after about serving as a curator at the Field Museum for about 9 years, about a decade, and being in the departments of anthropology at Northwestern and Illinois, Chicago. Once known as Chicago Circle. Professor Kasimba works broadly on complex societies in the state in Eastern Africa and then in its relationship to the wider circuit of the Indian Ocean. So he has projects on trade in the state running around the Indian Ocean. He's worked in Madagascar. He has a site that he's working on in India. He is negotiating in China about another site there, a trade-related site. So we have a wide reach. His work has been supported by all the big institutions, NSF, Winter-Gren, National Geographic, Eli and Lilly Foundation, etc. And he is the author of The Rise and Fall of Swahili States, which is part of the Altamira African Archaeology series. We'll send this around. And co-editor with his wife on the volume East African Archaeology, Foragers, Potters, Smiths, and Traders, coming out from the University of Pennsylvania Museum series several years back. So, Chop, I'm going to let you do what you're going to do, and then Dodi will catch his breath. Having caught his breath, we'll set us up for some thinking about how we're going to talk about your projects.
Thanks, John. You all have read this paper, but I'm an archaeologist, and so one of the things that I have to do is you can't really talk without showing some of the images. And I think this paper is very broad. It's actually 2 or 3 papers in one. And it's often very difficult when you are asked to write about a topic, and I think that until such a time that you're thinking about publishing it, that's when you begin to work with the editor to see what areas that you want to talk about and emphasize. But one of the, I have been doing research on the evolution of the state. Obviously, in East Africa, we're talking about secondary states, not some of those primary states, and so they're very small in terms of scale. In most cases, these states are really city-states for the most part. So I think it's really important to know what you're talking about when you're talking about the state, because it doesn't often look like this. So in terms of just definitions, these are some of the general definitions that, and I'll have this lecture, I think, available so that you can spend some time and look at it. We'll have to post it. So the state, in most cases, is a politically organized society that is regarded by those who live in it as sovereign or politically independent. It has leaders who control its social, political, legal, economic, and cultural activities. The city-state, which is a more accurate description of these places where I work, is a relatively small polity that consists of an urban core and is often surrounded by farmland containing smaller units of settlement. And so for the most part, even for the larger states, historically, because the state is always a work in progress. And when you're thinking about the build-up areas, it's the capital city, and often it's that farmland, those villages that actually produce produce most of the resources. The competition is often arising there. That's what is more exciting to me as an archaeologist rather than the build-up spaces that might actually be very good to a donor. But for me, in terms of the kinds of questions I'm asking, I'm much more interested in the urban, not the urban core, but in fact those peripheral, rural areas that make those states growing. And of course, the territorial state is a larger region consisting of multi-level hierarchy, provincial and local administrators. Usually it's a series of that. But when you think about trade or exchange, it's important to know what it really means. Exchange is intentional movement of goods, ideas, and services, and often people between groups. It usually occurs through a social network, and us as a means by which members of the network create, manage, and maintain those relationships. Right? So trading encounters are primarily about exchange, and it means that they are intentional, and in many ways they are not carried out in a coercive environment. Anything that is coercive, therefore, cannot be defined as trade or exchange. They have to have willing partners. And what is a trading system? From our standpoint as archaeologists, is a set of strategies that are used by people in the past to mobilize resources, minimize risk, as well as build alliances and social relationships in response to certain social and political conditions. And so a trading system is basically any archaeologically discernible regional or transregional exchange network. And we think about a lot of the work that have been carried out. I think it's really the work of Richard Blanton and his colleagues that presently really stands out. And I think that I'm talking about network and corporate strategies that a lot of that can apply to many, many places. And I think Richard Blanton, especially my colleague Gary Feynman, have discussed this at length. And I don't need to really go into greater detail about this. But obviously, I think whenever you are looking at the state, you can figure out whether the strategies that are being used lie more on the network side, where you have concentration of wealth, or corporate, where you might have more even distribution of wealth and things like that. But I don't want to delve so much into this. But in a lot of ways, and I've read a little bit about this here, over 5 millennia of trade specialists' interactions with and within complex political institutions have enabled traders to build a toolkit of how to survive and thrive strategies. These strategies are retained and passed on intergenerationally. The nature and forms of interaction have both positive and negative elements for interacting stakeholders. However, negative interactions between merchants and their clients often reinforce distrust and strained relationships. These strategies are usually operationalized within decentralized trader networks to maintain adaptive resilience to respond to changing conditions of political stability in complex polities from city-state to territorial empires. The primary strategies that shape these interactions are self-restraint and investment in networks, hence the network-based commerce. Trading behaviors, past and present, are universal strategies converging along the general ideas of demand and supply, profit generation, and wealth management. As trader diaspora studies have shown time and again, specific cultural knowledge of the clientele is basically limited to give the lady or man what he or she wants. However, trade specialist interactions with the local and regional socio-political systems are shaped by consistent and recurring conditions of social and political scapegoating. Throughout history, traders have been regarded as wealthy foreigners and vilified as parasites. Hence, they tend to be regulated by a suspicious political elite during peacetime and violently victimized by the same groups during difficult times. The constant fear of scapegoating and related violence has led to the generation of a self-restraining and limiting trader network culture. In our ethnographies on trade specialists, we have discerned 9 behavioral differences between self-restraining trade network-based communities. And I think that these are some of the 9 self-restraining networks. Behaviors that traders often build in order to protect their interests. So the first one is trade specialists invest heavily in socially embedded trade networks that are decentralized, self-organizing, and self-regulating. In terms of that information, agents, and resources are distributed across these decentralized networks to minimize accumulation of risk. And number 3, these relationships are often relative. Relative egalitarianism is practiced and enforced within these networks through voluntary engagement in essential. Essentially, traders as a minority group are very likely to self-regulate themselves in a lot of ways, but the relationship between them is often of a hierarchical nature, right? And this often guarantees the mechanisms to prevent growth of hierarchical competition and visibility of network to outsiders and reduction of censure. Often because they're a minority in the press, they try to find ways of, in fact, ensuring that their wealth is not so much visible. And also they self-police each other. There's great emphasis on self-restraint and trust within the network, with pressure on members to avoid ostentatious displays and visible accumulation of wealth. There's also deference to political pressure and maintenance of neutrality, even as they lobby for protection and expansion of business to ensure network longevity and resilience. Number 6, members interact across ethnic or political divides as the key objectives of interactions are enduring and mutually beneficial social economic systems. Number 7, they maintain focus on a core, so family business in good times and bad, allowing generation of enduring expertise and reputation. They minimize investment in local or regional ties, including purchase of land and large workshops, warehouses, due to the constant fear of scapegoating and and often, I think, if you look at the character of a lot of trading diasporas, whether they are in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, often I think traders avoid investing in resources such as large land holdings. And I think that this essentially does away the pressure. Right? And wealth is often kept fluid in both capital and credit and distributed across networks by investing in gold and other materials of high demand goods. These are not for display, but are stored wealth in highly convertible assets that have cross-cultural value. In essence, they invest in precious like gold. They can often, if things go south, they can always pack up and leave and reestablish themselves in another place. And these are characters that one finds among trading communities over the last 5,000 years. Finally, the fear of violence forces trade specialists to eschew activities that can be viewed as harmful to the local community. Though they indulge in parasitic activities such as money lending, it's under a threat of violent and constant negotiation of debt and credit with their clients. I think I need some water. My throat is drying. I'm sorry about that. So what are we really talking about here, and how might one model this kind of strategies that that traders essentially use. One of the, in thinking about this question, I worked with several of my students, and we essentially explored or most of the published literature in the English language about trade and trading systems. And we were able to sort of come up with a model that talks about just, unfortunately, we had to go back to Elman Services model of the typological scheme, and we developed an evolution of trade, a model for looking at the evolution of trading and trading systems that also very much mirrors what Elman Service had proposed, but in a sense focusing mostly on traders, because historically traders as an economic elite have often enjoyed protection, but also there's this tension with the political elite that goes on. And we also happen to believe that anytime you see the movement of these preciosities across geographical lines and political boundaries, it is not the political elite that are actually moving these products. It's the merchants, right? So in a lot of ways, because merchants are the ones who take the risk of leaving the comforts of their own communities to go to the other places. These are the people who are actually shaping and changing these communities rather than the political leaders themselves. Political leaders might provide security and others, but merchants are the ones that are the movers and shakers of these communities that we talk about. It's biased, but I think that nonetheless we have had to do that. So we developed these systems, and I think the first trading system, which is system 1, we argue that participants often engage in face-to-face exchange of gifts, commodities, service, and favors. So you can think about, for example, most the gift. You can think about the cooler ring system, for example, in the Pacific, as one of those. So in trading system 1 is largely akin to the reciprocal exchange of gifts, favors, and services. And this socially embedded exchange is the primary structuring mechanism and the basis for building, maintaining trade relationships and partnerships. Trading system 2 is a set of strategies used by mobile trade specialists. These are peddlers, tinkers, pastoralists, gypsies, who operate in small quantities of commodities at high risk and form relationships of reciprocity with settled societies. In trading system 3, this is dominated by the activities of ethnic traders or trading families. These are merchants and brokers who deal in large volumes and invest time, effort, and resources to maintain and expand relational networks to keep goods and capital moving within communities. And essentially, when you move to trading system 4, this is a strategy set used by established trading groups. These are entrepreneurs, large merchants, and portfolio capitalists in conditions of growing trade stability and friendliness. When you talk to most merchant families, whether they are in East Africa or Asia, wherever, often what you get is, in terms of generalizing, this is a Gujarati merchant in Pune, which is an area dominated by the Marathi in India. It told us that we don't need to teach our children how to do business, because making money is in their blood. What we have to teach them is how to make and keep friendships, and relationships. And I think that this is key for understanding how trader networks emerge and work, precisely because a lot of the businesses that we are talking about, ancient businesses that we're talking about, are really businesses that grew out of people trusting each other. They are kin-based networks. And I think that trust and honesty was very, very important. And these friendships were often inherited and self-regulating. Was much more important than, in fact, we seem to realize archaeologically, because we don't have any evidence for that. We can only draw that from the ethnographic record. Just some terms that I think, often I think are important that we need to know, that this group needs to know, are issues of locational stability, which essentially looks at increasing sedentism. As societies become more settled, you expect that their credit worthiness will increase, and therefore they become better trading partners. Sociopolitical stability is also very, very important. We use that to build our model, and also relational stability, which is as the state becomes more friendly to investments, then I think that the practitioners, the merchants become more comfortable in investing even more. But in building our model, we essentially started by looking at what could have in fact happened. So in trading systems 1, that might be looking at, for example, bands. Most of the practitioners were mobile foragers. There's reciprocal exchange. There may be some specialized trade and a few trade specialists, but the majority of the exchange is occurring at agglomerative meetings and events. It's very hard at this stage to locate markets. They just don't exist at all. In fact, we look at some of the obsidian studies that have been carried out in East Africa, some of which date to the last 200,000 years. You know that the movement of these products is being carried out somehow. There's some trade going on, but nonetheless, I think you can't really establish that. But when you increase location or introduce this variable of locational stability, something essentially happens within the system. Right? You have mostly tribal communities, pastoralists, itinerant traders, peddlers. They are constantly wary of political and social pressures because there's not a lot of security. But when you increase that, you essentially you move to the next stage, which is trading complex 2. If things don't work out, you revert back to an older model. If you add a second variable of political stability, and this has to do with, in fact, the emergence of chiefdoms and states, something else happens, which is a lot of the practitioners there, looking at economic complex polities and states. You have merchants, you have the emergence of brokers, you have entrepreneurs, and here you have the growing tension between the political and economic elite, right? But there is restraint. And I think that the traders in this case are restrained by those self-regulating things that I was talking about. If there's a crisis, you just revert back to the previous model. But if once you introduce relational stability, the state has a lot to do. There's more security. People are more friendly to trade. They have come to accept class differences and for celebrating their neighbors who are more wealthy than they are. Something else happens. This is when you have nation states, the growth of commercial lobbies, political power, the rise of portfolio capitalists, market capture, digital business. And in fact, at this stage, you have this tension that you have in stage 3 essentially breaking down, where the merchants essentially are not just kingmakers, but they crown themselves and they become kings. It's more like where we are today. If things So we just revert to the default in a lot of ways. But for me, what is archaeologically more significant is really looking at those crisis moments. It's that, the period of collapse. The period of collapse is much more significant for us. And I think that this is where I think most of our work is, because this is when you see change, this is when you see true leadership, both in terms of politics, but in terms of economics. That's when true leadership emerges. And for us, this is what is much more exciting. But let's look at what is on the ground in East Africa. East Africa, right around the time of the 1st century AD, this is how the Greeks had mapped out this region. What's very interesting is that the east coast of Africa, this particular area, the land of Punt, is actually known to these people as the land of where cinnamon is being produced. Right? But we know that cinnamon is not being produced here, but in fact cinnamon is grown here and is also grown way back here. But the Romans and the Greeks think that cinnamon comes from East Africa. Right? At the same time, we're talking about the settlement of an Austronesian-speaking community into, well, way back here in Madagascar. Right? So the nature of relationships here was very, very different. So you're talking about very, very old maritime relationship that are existing. So we know that we have established that. But for a long time, we didn't know anything about, we knew so much about the east coast of Africa. And in fact, our predecessors wrote about the archaeology and history of East Africa as if it did not really involve the rest of Africa. Well, we've changed that. And so during the same time, we've gone back, during the same time that we're talking about the maritime, during that period, we have the establishment of all these villages and towns along the east coast of Africa. There are about 400, perhaps even more of them. Some of them are small villages, small fishing villages, but several of them grow very rapidly to cover large areas, as much as 50 hectares of built-up spaces. Right? But in the hinterland, you also have similar developments going on. And these communities are essentially tied to each other in a lot of ways. You have communities that are inhabited by people you might call pejoratively today as foragers, but these are actually very highly specialized hunters. There are people who are hunting elephant, rhino, large cats, and supplying products like honey, spices that are in fact in high demand on the coast and across. You also have agro-pastoralists, you have, and then in the cities you have, along the coast, you have these urban communities that are essentially developing. If you look at the archaeological evidence that we are finding based on the excavations that we have carried out here in the hinterland and also along the coast, we see a system of interactions, of trade that is going on. From the interior to the coast, you have ivory, you have the rhinoceros horn, you have enslaved persons, precious metals, iron, bloom, you name it, they're all moving in this direction. And then from the coast, you have, of course, because these are cities and areas where local crafts industries that are, you have cloth and textiles moving in, the beads, marine shells, dry fish. Later period, you have guns also moving into the great ceramics, coconut oils, and other products, essentially moving in this direction. And of course, historians such as Claire Robertson have written about this for many years, but they talk about the 19th century relationships that were going on within East Africa. Archaeologically, we've been able to demonstrate that, in fact, these spheres are very, very long, and they have a 2,000-year period, and they are still ongoing. The issue is, how are these relationships being managed? We've developed an idea that Caldwell developed years ago based on his work. It's here in the Midwest, essentially. Looking at these, the relationship between these hinterland communities that might be small chiefdoms or even hunter-gatherer land dwellings. They are really a relationship of equals. They're peer quality interactions in many, many ways. And the relationships are hierarchical. The issue is not so much that we're talking about subsistence strategies, but we're talking about people who somehow what's the word? People who somehow have spheres of knowledge that they hold sway over how the means of the basic resources are in fact utilized. A good example is that if you look at peoples like the specialized hunters that you are seeing, that you find in the hinterland, these guys are hunting the elephants, rhinos, but they are also selling various poisons that everybody else needs to use to hunt. For example, the Wata of the Kenyan hinterland developed this potent poison that was being sold very widely in East Africa. This poison will kill another elephant in under 15 minutes. Right? The pastoral peoples, the Oromo, for example, are widely regarded and respected by the Swahilis along the coast because they are the ones who build and maintain the wells that these guys have. So they are the city's plumbers, all of that. And of course, the farmers are providing all of the grains that we essentially have. So you do have a sort of peer quality relationship that has developed. But in many ways, I think that the way that we have looked at these communities is to look at them as interaction spheres, and we've pushed this mosaic model as a way of understanding how these very disparate, diverse communities could have lived and coexisted for years without seeing any of these groups shifting to become what their ancestors were not. In other words, we don't see archaeologically the hunters striving to become pastoralists or urbanites. And this is a process that goes on for nearly 800 years. The question is, why are they not changing? I think they are not changing because the way we have been looking at these experiences has all been wrong. We have been looking at them as if they were subsistence strategies, rather than in fact looking at them as systems of knowledge that these communities hold sway, right? So a hunter, that is not just a forager, but it's the guy who controls and monopolizes certain systems of knowledge that are very, very crucial to the functioning of the entire system. They hunt the elephants, provide the ivory that these guys want. These ones are the plumbers, but they provide also the basic things like the skins, the meat, the milk, the butter that everyone wants, and the agro-pasture. So everyone is playing an important role. And so long as the system is very stable, nobody seems to be changing. Of course, there is some movement. And of course, we don't want to say that this was all okay, but there's conflict. And the conflict from a trader standpoint is price setting. There's also conflict over good arable land. There's conflict over trade networks. But in fact, these are mitigated by people building trade partnerships through the institution of black brotherhoods. These are agreements that these communities enter in order to maintain peace and continue to trade. So while this is going on, we see the emergence of these build-up monumental structures that we all love to see and celebrate. Right? So along the coast, you see the emergence of towns and cities. Gede, for example, on the Kenyan side, is now a major protected site. In Tanzania, you have Kilwa, and of course, as you move further north, you have Mogadishu, which is one of East Africa's oldest cities, still inhabited to this point. Some of the architecture that you see manifested along the coast is like these sites that you see in Takwa and Manda that I'm working today. But one of the things that you see too is the emergence of learning. This is a small Quranic mosque. It's a Quranic school that could have, it's very tiny. I think 20 young kids could have stayed here learning how to read and write. But this goes on in the region beginning from as early as 800 AD. If you look at some of the trenches that we have excavated, many cases I think they reveal subterranean structures. Like this one, for example, you have other walls emerging down here. And so we've been able to, at a town like Mana, where we've been working, we've been able to go down at least 6 occupational levels of build-up cities that emerge and go down to at least 1,000 to 1,500 years. If you look at what we are finding, you find that the majority of what is being used is actually local. So if you look at ceramics, 96% of all the ceramics is actually drawn from local resources. If you look at areas of industry in the hinterland during this period in the interior, you see huge investments in iron industries. And this is going on at the time you see the rise of urban areas along the coast. But what's happening too also at this time is you find evidence for, in fact, quality control. We found evidence of ivory, cut ivory, in archaeological context, dated between this time frame period. And the evidence for cut ivory is contrasted by what we actually see in the later period when East Africa, in the 19th century, are only exporting whole pieces of ivory. So here, in terms of price setting, they are able to grade and set their own prices. They are in control of their destiny. In the later period, they change. If you look at what we are finding in terms of other evidence of industry, you find that they're actually making beads and they are also making cloth. These spindle wheels are evidence of weaving, and of course this is evidence of bead making. And if you look at the bead industry itself, these beads were recovered from only one level, and you'll actually see that they are just probably 1 or 2 or 3, less than 5 glass beads. The rest are sort of local beads made out of ostrich eggshells and marine shells. And this is actually what you see across the entire stratigraphy. But the problem that we've had is often if you only take these tiny beads to analyze, of course they are thread beads, right? And you forget the rest of the beads, the story will be that these guys are not innovative because they don't have anything of their own. But when you put it all together, you'll actually be able to see that something is going on, and you have, these are communities that are in charge of their own destiny, but they're also engaged in international trade. And in fact, it's because they are very productive that international merchants are being attracted to come and do business with them, and sometimes even live and settle amongst them. One of the things that we have done in East Africa recently is that, yes, there is contact with Asia throughout. In fact, contact with China is indirectly being seen through the finding of Chinese beads that date to around the 6th, 7th century. But we know that silks are coming in. We also know that in the later period, you have ceramics, Chinese ceramics, we have Islamic ceramics from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, and all of that. But in many ways, I think we have used, or at least I have used, trade ceramics to illustrate class and wealth differences within these towns. Because beads could be purchased by anyone, but ceramics would not, and silks would. And so based on analysis of a lot of these Asian products, we are able to see which localities within the towns are wealthy and which ones are not, differentiated by, of course, wealth. Right? So if you look at, for example, this area in terms of white porcelain between the 16th centuries and you actually see that some localities actually don't have, but of course, area 4, which is essentially the area where most of the elites are living, you can see that they are still able to buy a lot of these products. You can actually see with blessed wares, these are mostly Islamic wares. You can actually see that most people can afford them. If you look at, for example, Celadon, you'll actually see that some of these neighborhoods are so poor that they cannot easily afford them in time. But when you do the chemical analysis of a lot of these Asian products, that's when you can actually see what's really going on, at least in the global market in terms of competition. We analyzed Chinese celadons and imitation ceramics that we have excavated from the site of Mtwapa, and we were actually able to demonstrate that although there are attempts to imitate Chinese ceramics, particularly by Middle Eastern investors, people still continue to buy and consume Chinese blue and white and celadons in such huge numbers. This is at the time when, of course, East Africa is entirely, East African economy and politically is dominated by, I think, relationship with Southwest Asia, mostly Iran, Persia, and the like. But you can actually see that Chinese products are still very, very highly popular in those areas. If you look at, for example, we also looked at the so-called Islamic shells, and what we were able to find is that among the South Asian blue and white, despite attempts by South Asian entrepreneurs to copy the authentic Chinese, you can actually see that the Chinese products are still very popular in those days, and the local merchants, whether they are in East Africa or North Africa, are still, in fact, preferring the Chinese. So in terms of competition, Chinese products are still extremely popular, but Chinese are not present in the Indian Ocean at this time. If you look at another product like, for example, beads, one of the things that we were able to establish is that a lot of the beads that are coming into East Africa in the later period are actually coming from the area of Gujarat and Maharashtra. But in the early period, a lot of the beads that came to East Africa were actually from South India and Sri Lanka. Up to at least 500 AD, a lot of the beads that we get here are from this region. But in the later period, you see a major shift, and beginning from the Islamic period, most of the beads to East Africa come from here. This, of course, changes when it comes to the 17th century, when a lot of the beads that come to East Africa are actually beads that are coming from Italy and was Central Europe, so the age of globalization. The question that I think is very important as far as trade is concerned, that's what I'm trying to explore these days, is essentially to look at how these traders who were often a trading diaspora were able to come to East Africa, become established, intermarry with the local natives, and have a huge impact that we actually see today. We know that these are the basics. Say the traders were rarely accompanied by their wives, and of course liaisons with local women were quite common. In some cases there was intermarriage, and whenever that intermarriage occurred, often I think they say these traders may have converted these women to their religion, in this case Islam. And of course, I would think that the emergence of a local diaspora community may have occurred around this, very much for this part. This is actually true everywhere. In North America, we know that this actually happens, and this is the rise of the mestizo communities in the New World. This is a product of these kinds of relationships. We are trying to figure these out essentially through genetic studies, and we have so far collected samples from 1,000 individuals, and we are now in the process of analyzing that as a way of constructing some of these biological genealogies and see how they manifest themselves. But in terms of work, it is very clear that these maritime centers or communities were essentially dominated by small-scale, more cottage industries that are essentially most likely run in small workshops that were part of a home. Whenever we excavate these residential areas, we find everything from broken up pieces to finished pieces. And the raw materials were made from start to finish, sold from the owner shop or at the city market. And of course, there was very little unemployment. Everyone was essentially unemployment. But in terms of just looking at what changes, if you look at issues of technology, we find in East Africa, very early on from the 8th century, the introduction of crucible steel method, which was used mainly in India, and beginning from at least the 3rd century BC, and becomes introduced to East Africa in the 7th century. We see introduction of rice and rice farming in the region. Of course, knowledge and of course cuisine today is very much part of, in terms of technology transfer, we see the introduction of the silkworm in East Africa. This particular ethnographic example is from Madagascar, but by the 8th century, you see places like Malindi and Pate are actually producing silk, which they are then selling regionally to other places. And I think that just to sum up, in many cases, one of the things we have found out is that ancient trade in the Indian Ocean could easily have been developed around these 5 variables, which is trust was very important, one's reputation, personal ties, goodwill of friends, and business development of good business contacts was very key. In fact, a lot of these interactions are going on between trading partners that have never met. And a lot of these ties were often inherited intergenerationally, and I think that they made life in the Indian Ocean, I think, very good, so long as there was stability in the area. And of course, Islam was in many ways extremely trader-friendly. So what do we know today? I think what we know is that rather than make a very big deal out of this, we know that yes, East Africa was extremely active in trade, but it was in many cases, as far in terms of scale, a junior partner. in commerce. I think this is the Bronze Age. Islam instituted very trade-friendly policies that encouraged trade and cultural interaction. Of course, interregional trade encouraged population migration and aggregation and urban development. And of course, political centralization and urbanism attracted more foreign trade and of course new ideologies. But as you move to the later period, the period of the transatlantic trade, you actually see that the introduction of very highly unregulated commerce, which was very much disastrous for the Indian Ocean, not just East Africa, but I think for the Indian Ocean economy. And I think that what we are finding in East Africa is actually quite similar to what is going on in other places. Thank you very much.
Lifetime's work in a single presentation.
Sorry.
No, I don't mean in terms
Yeah,
of the length, in
yeah,
terms of the
yeah.
richness of the materials.
First of all, my deepest apologies for being late. When John had asked me to comment on early state formation, I had only understood early in one sense and put it on my calendar for 3 o'clock. Unfortunately, in my rush here, I did not encounter the state. So I want to thank Professor Kusimba for a very stimulating paper, and to John Brook and to Greg Anderson for inviting me to provide some comments. Of course, we all have to be aware of the context in which we work, and today is Halloween, so some Halloween themes we can think of. I mean, if the scary story here of the legend of the sleepy grounding hollows, if you want to look at the Savo sites. But I think I was always a kid on Halloween, when you get to the door, they say, what are you? Right? And what's that costume? And so I should say that while I'm a historian who works on the Indian Ocean in the 19th century, my own work really is more, and my own work deals with multiple hinterlands, so I really appreciate, in fact I'll say more about it, but I really appreciate that aspect of the work. But I can't pretend to be dressed as an archaeologist or even a historian of the early modern, if you don't mind the teleology period. So to answer the perennial question of the day, I offer no tricks. Only treats, or at least entreaties, to entice us to use this paper to think about questions of state formation in relation to what happened on the Swahili coast. Professor Kusimba's paper uses archaeological evidence to examine East African coastal societies at 3 distinct scales: the city and hinterland, coast and interior, and the coast and what Professor Kusimba calls the Indian Ocean trading complex. I think it's useful to note that 2 of these are geographical understandings, and one of them is explicitly economic. And so we might think about how these scales fit together in terms of their conception. Asserting these interactions and the mutuality of these spheres is part of the paper's argument. But there's another implicit argument that I want to draw your attention to that you might have missed. You mentioned it briefly here. Is one as part of the things the paper does is it challenges colonial era archaeology and its racial assumptions about the ruins of stone buildings along Africa's Indian Ocean coasts. Scholars of that era, from the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, and there's some of them still practicing today, unfortunately, invoked civilizational discourses that pitted Arab or Islamic forms against Africans. And just to give you a sense of this, James Kirkman, who's someone at this time who surveyed the original survey of Gede in the 1940s and 50s, attributed the innovations of coastal settlements to Muslim foreigners. In his 1964 book, Men and Monuments of the East African Coast, he wrote that without these classes, the coast would have remained a land of mud or grass huts, like most of tropical Africa. He said, the historical monuments of East Africa belong not to the Africans, but to the Arabs and Arabized Persians, mixed in blood with the African, but in culture utterly apart from the Africans who surround them. So you can see, I just want to point this out so you can see the way that Professor Kusimba is doing something a lot more than that and offering us something very rich. Kirkman wasn't blind to his prejudicial approach, writing as he was in the year after Kenya's independence, but his apology in his introduction of his book explains much of his thinking. I regret that the true African plays such a small part in this book, but the post-prehistorical Africans who lived in this area did not build historical monuments in the sense which I used them. So Professor Kusimba and his generation of scholars have done admirable work in decolonizing archaeology in East Africa. But the ghosts of this intellectual past continue to haunt modern scholarship. And as we shall see, and I'll bring up some notions of modern state making. In the paper, Professor Kusimba formulates a view of coastal settlements focusing on Mtwapa, north of Mombasa, and situates them at the nexus of movement between hinterlands and seascapes. He talks about knowledge networks, about mosaics, about interactions and exchange. These are processes, and this I think is a very useful way of thinking about things. I think one of the things I have a concern about is this geographical determinism of what's African and what's Arab, or what's Indian Ocean, or what's Asian, and these kind of things, which he tries to avoid in most cases. Indeed, the focus on hinterlands and the Tsavo sites are some of the most exciting parts of this work for me, because it shows the trade and circulation of prestige goods from the Indian Ocean networks, and also things from the interior to the coast. And also based on this, the beads are again based on this process. Even describing the ways that the beads circulate, it's not beads of a certain place, it's circulation patterns of beads that you're described by process and circulation, not continental, not geographical. Again, this brings up a patternized notion of process geographies, which I think are very useful in looking at movement between places and breaking down these sort of continental boundaries, which sometimes give us trouble. If one of the long-standing scholarly concerns in East Africa has been the distinction between towns and countryside, which in some ways it has, or between the stone houses and wattle and daub huts or other kinds of buildings, Professor Kusimba's work shows this once again to be a false dichotomy. At the level of the town, even looking at his results from Mtwapa, you see these very interesting social gradations that exist both inside the walls of the town and outside the walls of the town. And the beads, again, particularly the recovery of beads in the Tsavo sites, turned the old adage on its head. It wasn't just people in stone houses who threw glass beads. You see this circulation both from people in stone houses and other kinds of places. So this, again, breaking down these ideas of these civilizational ideas that have shaped the way people have seen East Africa and state formation then. But as someone who worked in the 19th century, the presence of these globally circulating beads from an earlier period, and the discussion, as you bring up, of traders from elsewhere being able to dump cheap South Asian cloth, it's on page 34, also to me raises questions about East African consumers and their preferences. It raises these questions of historical agency that some of us are interested in. Because in the 19th century, when Richard Burton was traveling in the interior of East Africa, he and others encountered merchants who had come, Indian Ocean merchants who had come to the interior, who found themselves ruined by having the wrong kinds of beads. It wasn't just having beads or having cloth. People in the interior and elsewhere had very specific tastes about beads. And if you brought the wrong kind of beads, you were not going to be able to trade. And I know archaeology makes it hard for us to understand these kinds of things, but I'd love, as you find more, to be able to analyze the types of beads that are there and what shows up and how we might think about these kinds of things. Following Jeremy Prestholt's recent work, how did the consumer demands of Africans determine networks of trade and circulations of goods? They weren't just an endpoint, but to some degree these demands and these networks change things that are happening further away. You talked about the bidirectional piece. And how did those living in the hinterland of the coast shape the state, if at all? And indeed, questions about the state are central to this seminar, so I want to raise some of those. This paper hints at some processes and suggests some outcomes, but I'd like us to invite us to think more of these and to use this paper as a reflection point. First and foremost, was there an East African state? Was there or even an African state? This seminar has concerned itself somehow with the question of the existence of the state at all. Was the state real, or was the state a fiction, or a set of processes? And if we're looking at the evidence of the concentric circles from Mtwapa, or from Kilwa, or from Mombasa, or from Gede, in the medieval or the early modern periods, let's just, again, if we want to put a little candy in the bag of the political scientists and those who like typologies, was there a general monopoly on organized violence? right? The violence, really the violence that we see in this paper is mostly towards elephants, frankly. It's poison and it's arrows and these other kinds of things, but I worry that this paper and other work on the Indian Ocean buys into a kind of the Merry Africa approach, that before the colonial period, everything was non-violent, and everyone lived happily. And I think the Indian Ocean and its cosmopolitan nature lends itself to that kind of analysis. So, so when we think about violence, and the state helps us think about that, where does that happen? Were these cities or these city-states, were these self-consciously states? Yes, in Kilwa, they have their they're minting coins, there's other types of things, but what other ways can we think about this? The paper's analysis, and again, one of the promising parts of these overlapping spheres, but it suggests porous territorial boundaries. So if these are states, how can we think of them territorially? Are they light bulb states that only shine a certain distance, that get dimmer as you go? Or were these in fact colonies of other states? I mean, does their links outside is it important to understand that way? How do they territorialize their political power? How do they control circulation of goods? I mean, these basic questions about states, which I think there are ways of using archaeology to answer those. I'm not sure the paper does it exactly, so maybe you could say some more of that, or you guys could contribute something to help us, how we can think through this as a group. Again, for typologies, is this an Islamic state? Is this an African state? Is there even such thing as an African state? I mean, in some ways, if you look at the calendar for the Center for Historical Research, it was important to have an African, some sort of representative Africa if we're trying to do a global, but is that, again, do these geographical boundaries, do they confine us or do they help us understand something? How does, and in a broader methodological question, how does this, John Brooke raises this certain kind of way, how does archaeology help us excavate the state? And your project, I think you might say, it's not about the state as much as it's about political centralization and urbanism, which might go to suggest that the state is something that doesn't exist. And so although it might not be your project, I hope that we can use your paper and this conversation to advance our understanding of the state. And so for my final point, I'd like us to consider an additional layer of stratigraphy related to state-making activities that's not addressed directly in the paper. And that is the relationship between archaeology and the modern post-colonial state. Because the Kenyan state appears only fleetingly in the pages that we read. But I can tell you that the national park at Tsavo, where some of the excavations took place, and the archaeological sites at Jumbalamtwana, at Gede, and other places mentioned in the paper that are gazetted and preserved by the National Museum of Kenya, all contribute to state-making and state-maintenance activities. They attract tourists that are hard currencies, and they also help sustain a national narrative linking the state to its territory. So these sites are important for the state's imagination of itself and for imagination of its historical depth. But interestingly, the Kenyan state in the last 20 years has sought to reinscribe the same notions that the colonial era archaeologists did. The coast as something that's different, something that's foreign, something that's cosmopolitan. Again, bringing up African, things that are African versus things that are Arab or things that are outside. About a decade ago, a headline in one of the newspapers said, Kuna Kiswahili, Hakuna Waswahili, right? So this notion that there is Kiswahili as a language, but there's no tribal entity or group of people who are Waswahili. Again, erasing this kind of cosmopolitan coast from a territorial modern nation state. And the war on terror has only exacerbated these differences. There's a succession movement from Mombasa. There's attempts to clamp down on terror in East Africa, and the central state based in Nairobi willing to collaborate with the United States and others in terms of the global war on terror and its place and distancing the coast from the state concerns. This again, for Halloween, we see sometimes these early archaeologists or the Moi administration particularly, in the guise of the early archaeologists, dressed up in this same way and asking the same things and saying the same kinds of things. And I think this leads us to a broader set of questions about the role of cosmopolitan populations in the state. within the state, and questions of mobility and state formation and maintenance. And these questions of cosmopolitanism and mobility are true whether we're looking at the ancient East Africa in three different scales, or we're looking at the globalized world of today. So thank you very much for a wonderful paper.
Could I simplify Tony's many questions into one question, which will be, we won't call it the state, but we'll say state-like governance. So which came first? Trade or state-like governance? What is the dynamic? Because in your grand model, the state is very important. It provides stability. It's fundamental to the story, but it lurks. It sits in the background. It's not dynamic. It doesn't. We learn a lot more about trade and the dynamics of trade and the sense of the merchants moving against not against the states, but from between the states. But we don't see a lot about the stability process. So what I'm wondering about then is there pre-existing trade that requires state-like governance at certain nodes, or do those nodes emerge first and then they stabilize conditions for that elaborated trade?
See, the evidence for trade actually goes back to the Chilean period. That's about 500,000 years ago. And so I think that trade precedes the state in a lot of ways. If you look at the evolution of urbanism, let's say North Africa, it goes around these oases. And I think that these are nodes where, as these practitioners meet and trade, what were in essence meeting places or market towns eventually begin to grow and political actors essentially take over. So in a lot of ways, it's a chicken and egg question. But for the most part, I think my bias is that archaeologically I see the mostly unseen actor is the merchant, and I think that they're having a much bigger role in creating a lot of this. And often I think the state is on following the efforts. If you look at, for example, the late 19th, early 20th century, when you begin to see the development of retail business in East Africa, mostly through the agency of Gujarati merchants and traders. The state is actually following. Today, in places like Somalia, you can go wherever you are, but there will always be these artisan merchants who are bringing products to the villages usually on motorbikes or donkeys, camels. So I'm biased. I think that in most cases, I think the merchants are playing a much bigger role.
Well, I guess at some point, the existence of state-like governance begins to matter. And in the absence of that, you can't have a further elaboration of trade.
In fact, this has to do with these variables of the stabilities. But in many cases, as stability increases, which is as the power of the state increases, so does in fact more, let us see, the relationship becomes much more institutionalized. So from trading system one, you actually see there's most of the trade is actually not very permanent places, but as you move through the stages, when you have socio-political stability, that's when you begin to see institutionalization of the trading system. And so they all go hand in hand. But for the most part, I think that the engine behind this is the abilities of merchants or traders to risk going to another place and establish. The state then follows. The state's primary role is to provide, to make it possible and secure the regions. But they are only doing that once the system has already been.
Could you take the risk without the security?
Yes.
You could take the risk.
You could take the risk with security. In fact, I might argue that the model that we use today, which simply focuses on political stability, is a wrong one. But a lot of wealth has often been made during times of crisis. In part because maximization of profits is dependent upon creation of monopolies. So if you are to go to a place like this week in Lamu, there was a protest by the residents of Lamu against the Kenya government because they haven't lifted the curfew since they're dealing with this so-called terror wars. The community is suffering and they have not lifted curfew, but obviously there are few people who are running their boat services back and forth. And in those 2 days, the people who have been moving back and forth have made a lot of money because they're only got in places like Mogadishu today. Those who are taking the risk and investing there, they are making a lot of money. Places that one will invest today, where a Wall Street merchant would never think of investing in Pakistan or Afghanistan. These are places where once you set up a factory, you have monopoly, you are protected by the warlords, and you are also protected by the government. And so, in many cases, I think it's during those crisis moments a lot of dumping is done and a lot of wealth is made during that time. And those who take the risks often, I think, from the data we have, often end up extremely wealthy. But during political times when it's peaceful, the state is very powerful, it regulates trade, and therefore, you're sort of just making through a lot of things. And in essence, I think, John, when you look at the monumentality that emerges on the east coast of Africa, superficially, this is sort of the golden age of civilization. But in fact, it isn't. Because at this time, these communities are, in fact, relying on import substitution. They're getting a lot of their products from outside, but they're not investing in the local industries. They're essentially divesting. For example, if you look at the weaving industry, it's going, ironworking industries are completely, they divest in those, but they begin focusing more on import substitution, where they're buying cheaply made products from South Asia, Middle East, China, and within 200 years, everything just essentially collapses. But monumentality is there, so you can actually see that, oh, these guys were doing extremely well. But no, a few people prospered, the rest of the community, in fact, is more like what we see today.
Could you just give us a bit more sense? You use the word community there. I mean, what kind of a community are we talking about here? Obviously, it's not everyone living in big, fancy-looking houses with wonderful Islamic architectural features.
Yeah.
So, what does the rest of the community look like, as it were, and what sense of a commonality is there among them? I mean, you present a picture, I would say, of an extraordinarily individualistic society, albeit one that functions according to trusts and bonds and relationships and so forth, but all of the motivations are coming for self, what's the word, you know, these are utility maximizing
Yeah,
capitalists,
yeah,
or
yeah,
let's use the word. I mean,
does, yeah.
essentially that's what they're looking like, as
Yeah.
capitalists, and
Yeah.
what need have they of other people? I mean, are they seem like they're operating very much like sort of free agents and importing as they will, you know, drawing on raw materials from the hinterland as they so need. Where is the sense of the community here that they are a part of and that they might think actually produce them, as it were?
That's a very good question. The irony is that they build up spaces that remain today may in fact constitute less than 5% of what these communities were like. The majority of the residents are living in mud and daub houses, even up to by the 70s, places like Lamu that had stone houses. Those stone houses constituted only about 30% of the entire community. So the community is actually living in average mud and daub structures with a few elites, usually around the central area, around the Friday Mosque. Those are the places that remain today, and so they primarily a small minority. The rest of the communities are just living in ordinary semi-permanent structures that archaeologically are not there. But interestingly, that's not so interesting archaeologically. What's interesting archaeologically is that what these people are using and what they are eating, we don't see any major differences in that of both communities that are living in these semi-permanent structures with those that are living in more elite structures. They are eating more or less the same things, they are consuming more or less the same things. Of course, in town it comes to more expensive items, household items like ceramics, you can see distinct features, but when you look at the diet, in terms of the fauna, kinds of fishes that they are eating, pretty much the same. So in terms of qualitatively, their lives are not very different. But there's a huge difference after the 17th century. And there's a combination of the little ice age, the drying up of the wells, people departing. But what we find is the data not so much from the coast, but the data we find in Salmo, where these hunters that have a reputation of killing and tracking elephants and rhino, buffalo, are suddenly eating non-migratory herds, small size, so like hyraxes and big. They're not eating any size 4 or size 5 fauna like the buffalo. They are eating frogs and snakes, snails. So their diet completely changes. So the question is, what's happening here? What's happening is because of predatory commerce, which I didn't have time to talk about, but I addressed in the paper, things completely changed. You have, of course, the institution of slavery, where it becomes, the whole landscape becomes too insecure for even these so-called specialized hunters to go out there and hunt. And then, of course, you have other changes that occur with the overhunting of the elephants that completely make the region very, very insecure, but also ridden with diseases like trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, that just wreak havoc to the entire regional economy and people. So there are a number of things that occur. One is the effects of the little ice age, which we have not addressed here, but the other one is, of course, the predatory commerce that begins after the 17th century. It completely destroys the stable economies that had then existed for several thousands of years.
Should we open this up a bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very exciting and illuminating paper. I have a very quick question. I'm very happy that you've been able to see the reciprocity between the East African coast on the one hand and activities going on in Southeast Asia. Now, in terms of the products that we've talked about, what seems to be emerging is that people in the West African coast were mostly consuming goods that were coming from South Asia, and we haven't seen the reverse. Now, in the case of West Africa, of course, the Macintosh have been able to unveil the fact that starting from about, at least as the evidence indicates, from about 900 AD all the way into the 16th century, West African goods, not only gold, initially people thought West Africa was only supplying gold to Europe and the Maghreb, the Morocco area. But in reality, these archaeologists have also been able to find out that raw hide, leatherworks, clothing were in fact leaving West Africa, going to Europe through Morocco. And indeed, some of them were initially named Moroccan leather, when the reality was that they were coming from the Hausa regions of today northern Nigeria. So my question is, do we have an equivalent reciprocity in terms of consumption, import and consumption going on the East African coast?
Yes, there is. There is, for the most part, what we're finding is this small-scale craft industries did in fact exist. And I think that for the most part, they served the needs of the local community, meaning both coast and hinterland. And this is a thriving trade that is going on for several hundreds of years. And I think that when foreign merchants discover that you actually have this place right around, push the time to the time of the Peloponnese of the Erythraean Sea, that's when we at least we encounter this. These communities are very much highly evolved, and that's why when they come in, they interlock on an already pre-existing systems of trade. Otherwise, why would they have risk coming to East Africa if East Africa had nothing to offer? What we see archaeologically is a very highly complex system of industrial investment. The ironworking industries that we see developing in East Africa are actually quite complex. Some of the sites that we have found that date to around 800 AD are huge. They are as large as 2 to 3 hectares in size. So you're really talking about industrial productions that are quite sophisticated. This is in the hinterland. At the same time, we see huge investments in farming. In Savo, during that same period, we see the development of single household estates that are developing, surrounded by hedgerows. But you see this going on. This, of course, changes after the 17th century when people just abandoned these places. But we found huge settlements. Usually, we identify them by looking at some of the mound structures, the cemeteries that still exist today. But nonetheless, you see these huge developments, large chiefdom-like settlements within the Savo National Park that we've now been able to identify. Certainly, I think what we do know is that by around first century AD, contact between the hinterland and the coast becomes much more regular. But before that, there isn't much. It becomes much more regular, but the trade items that are moving back and forth are mostly local. In other words, you have marine products moving from the coast into the interior, and you have interior products moving back and forth. Right. So my assumption is that my hypothesis here is that the foundation of these urban areas along the coast is really, they were quite diverse from the very beginning. And I think that a lot of the changes that we see today occur when the urbanites, being in contact with mostly foreign merchants, begin to take a little bit here, a little bit there. Our diet, for example, in East Africa, what we eat today, is primarily heavily influenced by South Asian and Southeast Asian cuisine, right? As well as, of course, Southwest Asia. Our religion and our politics is very much influenced by Muslim codes of conduct, legal conduct. If you look at our business models are primarily influenced by Urdu, Gujarati business practices. And so we sort of, because of these interactions, we were able to gain something, but were also in many ways, for many years, in charge of price setting of our products. And you can see this by some of the evidence I showed here. When they are in the hinterland around 800 AD, these hinterland peoples are cutting ivory and grading it before they can send it to the coast. By the 17th century, it's not just East Africa that gets affected, but you can actually see, when you looked at the ivory exports, we see that in the past, a lot of the ivory that was destined to China was being exported through the port of Surat. But I think by the 18th, 19th centuries, we begin to see the decline of Surat, and of course, Mumbai becomes the major port. So ivory comes from East Africa, shipped to Mumbai, and then is always transshipped there to Europe and to the United States. What happens in India this time, because India was exporting cloth to East Africa, India begins at the same time, begins to import now raw cotton, right, to Europe. Right? So these events are happening, but they're affecting all of these regions. And I think that that's, but the Macintosh's work here, I think, was very illustrative of what was going on. I think they were able to demonstrate that these communities were extremely vibrant economies. They developed their own industries, and they served all of these regions. In West Africa, one of the things that they did was that the Nupe, for example, began to throw, they developed bead-making industries. And they supplied a lot of the beads that were consumed in West Africa. And this is an issue that, of course, archaeologists are still having trouble recognizing. We just had a paper turned down, and it clearly demonstrates the foundational industries of bead making in West Africa that are just as old as what we find in Central Europe. But there's still resistance to some of these ideas.
No, as archaeologists, you know, like we would probably talk about somewhat different things here, but for the purposes of this group, I think it's important to understand that you know, your approach, which is multi-scalar, regional, you know, is also is essential to understanding the workings of these things, but also the fact that, you know, sort of as archaeologists, we're supposed to, you know, have the longer view, like have the time depth where we can track out and trace the models, you know, how they change, or do they settle, you know, do the patterns change over time? But I just wanted to ask you, for these purposes, like, what do you think would have happened if the 17th century, the collapses had, the disruptions had occurred?
That's a very good question, and I think that what could have happened, the two events that happened in basically they're global events. The Little Ice Age had a huge impact. But studies, the morphological studies have revealed that the levels of the Nile were very low. And so even if nothing happened, the Swahili coast will have gone through a huge period of decline, because this actually happened. And in my book, in my first book, I think I essentially give the Portuguese too much credit for the destruction of sort of these civilizations along the along the Indian Ocean, because they banned their way. They introduced a new system of warfare that was then unknown to these communities. And we give them too much credit. To a very small potato in the game, because I think the three empires, the Safavid, the Gauls, and the Ottoman Empire, were much too powerful. But they are also responding to these changes. And so even without the European presence, I think that South Africa peaked, and I think we will have to be recovered after some time. But the events that occurred in the 17th century, in many cases, I think, were ongoing, and I think did not have, in many ways, stopped. I don't know, but I do think that the Little Ice Age had a very huge impact on the then existing political economies in the whole region. And when you think about the histories, the various histories of East Africans, they actually remember events by the various famines and hungers and droughts that existed at the time. And because of that very unstable climate, the impact was ever so great. So I don't know. I don't know what would have happened. But I think my perspective was if the roles were reversed, I think that Africans were quite as capable of colonizing other groups if the roles were reversed. It's just that the Black Death was such a significant part of it because it changed the roles. Europe recovered much faster than the rest of the world. So it's just a question of numbers, and Europeans were then able to push everyone back. But before that, I think Asia was really powerful. And I think that those events we're beginning to witness now, that in fact now we can't truly compete with Asia, particularly East Asia, because it's still the game of numbers. They have the money, our money, they have the people, they have resources. We just simply can't compete at this point. And I think that the 17th century was such a time when Europe was becoming increasingly powerful, that these other smaller, still powerful, but power of Asia was declining.
I guess just a follow-up real quick. A lot of people say, oh, you can divide states into city-states and territorial states.
Yeah.
And others say that these were stages. But do you think that if disruptions hadn't happened, the city-states may have moved forward becoming more or there could have been the emergence of larger territorial states?
Yeah, I think that was happening. Thank you for that. That was happening within the region itself. So that some of the then emerging cities like Pate, of course, Lamu, Mombasa, Pate, for example, and Lamu and Mombasa were always at loggerheads, because Malindi was also one of those states. And were often competing for control over the resources of the hinterland. But at the same time, they are also fighting each other over the control of the more productive islands like Pemba, which has all of Pemba has very rich arable land. Also receives a lot of rain. And so there was always that rivalry and competition over control of resources from the hinterland, also competition over relationship with the merchants. So each town wants foreign merchants to come to the, so they are sweetening the deal at all times. Lamu especially had a history of welcoming foreign merchants. When the Omanis come, Lamu is one of those towns that welcomes them because they want to use them against their mortal enemies like party or the CU and other places.
Even when Vasco da Gama lands, right? And he comes to Mombasa first and is turned away and goes to Malindi and is immediately sucked into
Yeah.
kind of a rivalry between
Yeah.
these cities.
Yeah.
And they're trying to use Portuguese power to defeat Mombasa
realize
as a kind of that extra piece in the
Yeah.
rivalry.
So in fact, that could have, so I think that the presence of Europeans did stop that, particularly the Omanis, I think, of Portuguese and the stopped that momentum of, in fact, territorial expansion. Yeah.
We should probably call it quits now, I'm afraid to say, because we are kind of, we have people who have a 3:30 plan and now it's 4, so we're gonna stop for formal session and people want to stick around for a few more questions, but let me just leave it rather with that.